December 30th, 2023, and this video is called, What Does 1200 becquerels of cesium per kilogram in your food look like? Now later in the video, I'm going to show you with some Christmas lights and a glass jar, kind of what it kind of looks like, what they're allowing. Now, 1200 becquerels is the limit that they placed on. That's what the United States deems safe. Now, the other interesting thing is cesium mimics potassium when you ingest it, but each component of the diet contributes potassium evenly to the diet. However, almost half of the cesium is estimated to be contributed just through meat, eggs, and milk products. Now, where does cesium go in the body? Potassium is absorbed via passive diffusion, primarily in the small intestines. About 90% of ingested potassium is absorbed and used to maintain its normal intra and extracellular concentrations. Now, when your body eats cesium, it thinks it's ingesting potassium. It doesn't think that it's ingesting cesium, so it gets rid of it. It actually goes into your body. Now, cesium, while in the body, cesium-137 poses a health hazard from both beta and gamma radiation, and the main health concern is associated with the increased likelihood for inducing cancers. So it is a carcinogenic material. Now, a becquerel is in a standard international unit. It's for a radioactive decay. Now, measuring the activity of a substance, and it's defined as one nucleus decaying per second. So when you have 1200 becquerels in a kilogram, that means you have 1200 decays in 1 second. And that's why it looks like a Christmas tree. It's ridiculous. Now, not only were shipping restrictions placed on food inside Japan, many countries around the world also took measures to ban the imports of food from Japan. 54 countries and regions introduced import restrictions on food from Japan after the accident. Now, 35 countries and regions have rescinded the restrictions, while 19 countries and regions still have restrictions in place as of September 2020. Now, the United States is one of them that lifted that restriction. Now, the levels of the regulation are based on the assumption that if 10% of the food consumption of a person over a full year would be contaminated at these levels, that its annual exposure to ionizing radiation would not exceed an additional annual dose limit for a human being at 1 millisievert. Now, that's what's strange. In Japan, it's assumed that general food, it's at 50%. In the United States, it's just assumed that 30% of our food is contaminated, but I don't see how they get that number is because we're not testing anything. Now, where does it go? Cesium, where does it leave the body? After radioactive cesium is ingested, it's distributed fairly uniformly throughout the body's soft tissues. Now, what's interesting is a biological half-life of cesium is 70 days. Now, the physical half-life is 30 years. So if you do the math, it's going to take 300 years for that to disappear or actually turn into a daughter isotope. In your body, it takes 70 days for a half-life. So within 140 days, it's half of that half-life gone. So it stays in your body for quite a while. Unlike stuff like strontium where it's in your bones, it probably stays like forever. Now, the time required for a biological system such as a human to eliminate by natural processes half of the amount of the substance, such as a radioactive material that has entered it. That's the biological half-life. Now, fractions of food intake are assumed to be contaminated. This is for Fukushima. For food consumed by most members of the general public, 10% of the dietary intakes was assumed to be contaminated. This assumption recognizes the ready availability of uncontaminated food from affected areas of the United States or through importation from other countries, and also that many factors could reduce or eliminate contamination of local food by the time it reaches the market. If anything, that might be talking about iodine, which has got a half-life of 8 days. So it makes no sense that they assume that the contamination just by travel is going to be eliminated. Now, this is what I'm talking about through the FDA. When they started in 2011, they did start testing stuff, these imports from Japan. But if you notice the not detected category, it's a little deceiving, because the non-detective means that contamination may be present, but it's less than the limit of detection, which is typically 1 to 10 becquerels. So even though it says it's not detected, doesn't mean it's not in there. It's just it's below this range. Now, the FDA benchmark for cesium, it was 1,200 becquerels. So you could have up to 1,200 disintegrations a second per kilogram. So they state that the observed level for the sample does not pose a public health concern if it's below this 1,200. Well, I would say anything of any type of contamination of the radiation is going to be, not good for your body. I mean, okay, so how much is a kilogram of rice? This is something to put into perspective. So if you take between 4 and 4.5 cups of rice, that's going to be a kilogram. Now, how many grams are in a kilogram? It's basically 1,000 grams. Now, this is interesting. Infant formula, this container contains 900 grams. So this is almost basically 1 kilogram. Remember, 1,000 grams is 1 kilogram. So this is basically the amount of that product. If it was this baby infant food formula, you would allow 1,200 disintegrations within this canister of baby formula. So if you look, that don't look like a big amount, for you to have 1,200 disintegrations in it, or up to 1,200 disintegrations. So here is the provisional restrictions right after for Japan in 2011. Now, what they did is they raised it to 500 for vegetables, grains, meat, fish, 200 for milk and dairy, and 200 for drinking water. Then at 2012, they had a new standard for radiation. So they brought it down to general foods 100, infant foods 50, cow milk is 50, drinking water 10. Now, this is a lower standard because it's assumed that general food, it's at 50%. So it states that it is necessary to point out that in reality, almost no measurement of radionuclides other than radioactive cesium is being currently carried out. So they're only testing for radiation. They're not testing. They set the standard for strontium and plutonium as well, but they're not testing for it in the food. The setting of the standards does not mean that any value below the standard is absolutely safe, but that when internal exposure occurs from ingestion of the food contaminated with radioactive substances, it represents the value the government has determined that is considered to be acceptable for exposure doses. Okay, I wanted to add this because I thought this was curious. So in 2011, there was approximately 130,000 tests with a 16% cesium detection rate. So what that equals is almost 21,000 tests detected cesium. Just out of 130,000 tests, 16% contained it. So that's still almost 21,000 detections. And you only tested 130,000 pieces. So if you look at countrywide in Japan, there was a lot of contaminated food. So you go to 2019, and there's about approximately 280,000 tests. And out of that, you have 2% is being detected. But that's still 5,600 radioactive items out of close to 300,000. So for every 250,000 tests, there's 5,600 that are positive for cesium. But what I find fascinating, it looks like most of the contamination, it's going up the food chain. It's in the livestock. See, first it came down on the agricultural products. Then those are being eaten by the cows, which is giving you the milk and dairy, and also the livestock. So, you know who's next in the food chain? It's us. We're at the very top here. But the majority of the contamination is coming out of the livestock products. I just thought that was interesting. The ratios. Food contamination is taken up by the media only when the contamination exceeding standards is discovered. In reality, however, food contaminated by radiation above the detection limit but below the standards exists in large amounts. It is clear that once an environment has been contaminated by a nuclear accident, it is impossible to return to its former state. So there is no virgin land over there. What I find interesting in here, this is the radioactive cesium concentration in the wild boars by habitat. This is as of 2019. Now, if you look, there are lower becquerels down in here. But if you notice, these prefectures, Fukushima, however you pronounce these, Gunma, Miyagi, Abarakai, the prefectures, they are all recording cesium in the radioactive boars. But what I find interesting is here is Japan, and these are all the prefectures in it. And so those prefectures I highlighted. Number 7 is Fukushima. Number 9 is Tochigi. 12 is Chiba. 10 is Gunma. 4 is Miyagi. And 8 is Ibaraki. Now, what I'm telling you here is, if Fukushima is in 7, and these are the areas that you have the radioactive boar, you could see that the fallout went a lot further than they're probably leading on to, because the government is actually doing the tests. So if you look at this cesium soil detection, this has been done by a citizen testers. It's the citizens that were testing for this. And as you could see, there's the Ibaraki down in here. So you could see the plume kind of went, it went all the way down to Tokyo down in here. So the depth and the spread of the contamination is a lot more than the government wants to lead us on to. Now, this is at their testing. This is the Japan testing of all those tests over there. But what I find amazing is, this is as of 2023. Cesium-134 and Cesium-137, here's the cesium totals. If you look, they're at smaller rates. But if you look at the chart here, they're not all zeros. So all this stuff is below the allowable amounts that they're allowing in the food. But if you look, almost every test has got some sort of cesium-137 and 134 in it. I can't read why that's like that. But if you look at these are the becquerels of 5, 9, 5, 9, 5, 7, 9, 11. So it looks like it's a low amount, but if you're eating, that's why it's assumed in Japan that 100% of the food they're eating is contaminated, because according to these tests, it is contaminated. It's at small amounts, but if you're in Japan, I mean, you're kind of screwed, because that's like cesium in every meal. Now, here is something crucial too. Reactor 3 had MOX fuel, which is the reactor was burning uranium and plutonium mixed. Now, it states contamination from this unit could therefore lead to plutonium fallout. Now, if and I'll show you right now, this is reactor 3 right here. Check this out. This right here is the plutonium and uranium MOX fuel. So they might be telling us just cesium, but there's also plutonium. Reactor 3 had 88 tons. I mean, that's a big number. And here's all the other reactors, how many tons and tons of that stuff is spread throughout the country. Now, it states that city officials put blame on increased patients for the spat of cancers. The number of patients had been decreased after 2012. But if you look, they're not testing. It says increased cancers in Tokyo in the metro area by 600,000 suggests that there's a link to Fukushima and the nuclear fallout. Cases soar by 47% between 2015 and 2016 in Tokyo, more than expected. This is childhood thyroid cancers diagnosed at the Fukushima Medical University. And if you look at 2011, these are leukemias, thyroid cancers. Up until 2011, it just goes way up in all those categories. So definitely there's cancer going on in Japan. It's just being covered up by the media and the government. Now, here is the food radiation standards for several countries. Now, here's the provisional. Before, right at Fukushima, it was 500. The new standards, they went down to 100. Now, in the Codex, I think that's for the European Union, they're at 1,000. Ukraine, they're kind of a little bit lower. Germany, the same. Really low. But if you look at the United States, look at this guidance intervention level. For general foods and infant foods, it's 1,200. For drinking water, 629. And this is where I was talking about the assumed proportion of contaminated food in Japan. Look at now, it's infant food and drinking water is assumed to be 100% contaminated. General food, it's at 50%. That's why they have lower thresholds. But in the United States, it's assumed 30% of the food we eat is contaminated. That's why they give it a higher becquerel rate. So Fukushima basically changed everything. Before Fukushima, we didn't have this. And before Fukushima, everything in Japan wasn't contaminated. But now it is. And I'll tell you what, they're not testing the stuff that's coming over here. So how do we even know what we're eating? I'm going to show you right now what I believe is a demonstration of the 1,200 becquerels per kilogram in our food. All right, so this is a jar with 1,200 lights in it, 2 strands of 600. So when they're blinking, that means half of them are on, half of them are off. That means 600 at one time. So this is a full 1,200 here, right? So this is 1,200 of them. This is 600. That's 600 at a time right there. Not at 1 second. But this is the 1,200. This is what they allow in that baby formula jar. Up to this amount they deem safe. All right, here is a glass jar that I put 1,200 Christmas lights in it. That is approximately the size of that baby formula container. Now I'm going to slow this down where those are at 1 second intervals. But basically, this is 1,200 becquerels a kilogram right here. Each one of those is a disintegration. Now, is that amazing? That they're allowing up to this much in our food. Now here's going to be 1 second intervals.
emanating from. Look at it. Keep looking at it. This is day after day after day after day after day. It's still doing it day after day after day. It's still emanating from there, still hemorrhaging from there, still coming out of there. That never ever changed, okay?
Condition that the Japanese are beginning to call black rain. Fukushima may be continuing to release radiation for a long time. Now this is cesium, it's got a 30-year half-life. But 30 years from now, it's still going to be disintegrating at 250,000 disintegrations per second. And 30 years after that, at 125,000 disintegrations per second. This contamination then has spread beyond the Fukushima prefecture, yet the prefecture itself seems to be the only place that the Japanese are worried about this radioactive exposure. In particular, due to the black rain, clouds of radioactive particles, hot particles, depositing everywhere